Is personality largely an illusion? And if it is, does that free us up to be whoever we want to be? Think about a child and something happens to them. Maybe they're bitten by a dog. Throughout their whole life, they're afraid of dogs. That becomes a facet of their personality. Is that something that is inherent to them? Is that truly them? Or is that almost a wrinkle, like a divot, a change that now is them, but does that mean it's inherent to their true nature? Does that mean that it can change back to be a different way if they have other experiences with dogs? I think about this a lot, and the idea that so much of our personality is simply based on certain events, certain people we've encountered, certain environments we've been in our entire lives, and then we've taken on masks, we've put on certain outfits, we've become a certain type of a person as a function of these environments. These are the reasons, in addition to some other ones that we're about to get into, that I do think largely personality is an illusion. While a lot of this video is my views and observations, we will get into some research, particularly at the end. At the end, we will also get into common questions on this topic. The reason why I say largely, and I'm not making a bold enough claim to say personality is in totality an illusion, is because, and this gets into almost certain belief systems, but I believe that there is an inherent essence that is you, that is underneath all of those experiences. Or someone that's more scientifically minded might just say genetics. Depending on how much interaction you've had with children or babies, there could be two babies, and before they've even had very many experiences, they could have very different personalities. One might be cranky, one might be very laid back, both so worthy of love. Now, I am a woman of science, so I do believe in genetics. I'm not saying that it is about the soul or genetics, but let's take the example of the cranky baby. One of my friends had a child that was very gassy, and so he just cried constantly. Later, they actually found out that he also had an issue with his hearing, and that can also lead a baby to be pretty upset. Imagine having no control over your life because you're a baby, and then not having full capacity of your senses either. That would be a scary thing and might lead you to cry too as a 3-month-old. So all of that comes down to genetics, of course, or what we're inherently born with. But in the bulk of this video, I want to more so explore what are the adaptive changes that we have made so that we can choose to make different ones, so that we don't feel trapped into one way of being. Because as soon as you say, I'm shy, I don't really interact well with others, I don't like to go out and meet new people, you've kind of boxed yourself in. You've told yourself a certain story, and now that's the person not only that you've been, but it's the person that you're becoming because you're not challenging that notion of who you are and who you could be. And of course, there is nothing wrong with being shy or a bit closed off. What my point is here is that we're trying to get away from latching onto a story about ourselves that boxes ourselves into only one way of being or limits our potential future behavior. You've probably noticed that in certain settings, you're one way, and in certain settings, you're another way. Maybe at work, people think that you're quiet just because you really like to focus on the task at hand, and you don't want to chit-chat because you're not good at multitasking, and you want to get done so that you can go and see your family or see your friends, or just go do a hobby that you love. You don't want to dilly-dally at work. So then people there might describe you as quiet or to yourself. But then maybe in your friend group that you've known since you were very young, you're loud, you're gregarious, you're funny, you're the person with the one-liners. So who are you? Are you the closed off person or are you the warm person? You're both. We contain multitudes. We're like diamonds that in different settings reflect different colors, different types of light. This is one reason why I love being an actor. That's one of the things that I do in addition to this channel. And I truly believe that humans are rageful. Humans are compassionate. Humans are jealous. Humans are so many things. They're selfish. They can be selfless. And we try to disown all the parts that we don't want to be, that we want to pretend that we're not. So much of that is what becomes ego or becomes our identity. And then we feel threatened when other people interpret us other ways, when we meet someone else who has a similar identity. Maybe you take pride in being, I'm going to go with an immature one here, the attractive person in the group or in a certain setting, and then someone else very attractive comes into the play, and it's like, oh, well, are you the attractive one? First of all, you can both be attractive. Secondly, it's like based on certain settings, we've gotten validated for certain things, and then we learn to play up those things. And then slowly, again, this ego identity, this personality, this formation of who we are takes shape. So let's say that you take pride in being intelligent. Maybe you were in the fast reading group in school, and then you kept getting into the better classes, the better math classes. You went to certain schools, got certain grades, and then maybe got a certain job that rewarded your intelligence. So not only are you rewarded for a certain attribute, then you pour more into that, you work harder in that area, it becomes a cycle that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, more baked into who you are. And it can go both ways. Let's say that someone, unfortunately, was abused very young. They might form in their mind an interpretation of who they are in relation to others and their worth, what they deserve from other people. And we know, unfortunately, that those people will often attract partners or friends that treat them poorly too, because they just think, well, that's what a relationship is. That's how relationships feel. They don't know they can do better or that it can be better. And a lot of this is subconscious. Then maybe that makes their financial situation more difficult because it's really hard to thrive in any area of life when you're in an abusive relationship. Maybe they're able to escape that, but because of their financial hardships, they get thrown into another difficult situation. It's a negative spiral the other way. So then that person might have a story of, I can't break out of these cycles, or I have low self-worth, or I'm unable to make good money or keep a relationship. And that becomes what they think that their identity is or their personality. Now, I'm using identity and personality interchangeably. This sense of who you are in the world, who you are compared to other people or with other people as you interact. It's also so much of an illusion because it's who you compare against. Let's say that your friend is just the epitome of organization. Their closet has different boxes for different seasons. They're always up with their planner, their meal prep. They're always early to things. They're just thought of as this extremely put together person. You know, everything is just kind of polished, and they maybe spend a lot of effort in being this way, because don't let them deceive you, guys. That takes a lot of effort. I don't care who's doing it. So then you become known as kind of the fly by the seat of your pants, loosey-goosey one in the relationship, maybe the silly one, the more spontaneous one who's not as habit-driven. But if you were to compare yourself to someone that maybe you make another friend later on who's further on that direction with the spontaneity, then you might be considered the more buttoned-up, polished one. So it's like all kind of relative, and that's why comparisons are so silly too, because you can always find someone who's more of something, and we have thousands and thousands of attributes. Saying that you're the something one, I don't know. I just think it's a really poor thing to form a sense of self around. And I think that it's much more valuable to just think of who you are deep down as a human being that can't be compared to someone else. If we do contain these multitudes, if we can be any way at any given time, why do we fall into these patterns of being? Which that is really what a personality is. It is, in fact, let's pull up the definition here. Personality is defined by Oxford Dictionary, the combination of characteristics or qualities that form an individual's distinctive character. And then it gives an example. She had a sunny personality that was very engaging. And then synonyms: character, nature, disposition, temperament, etc. It's tricky, right? Because again, it's like compared to what? So for instance, if you have 3 different people and one of them is extremely engaging, to go with that example that they were giving there, one of them is less so on the spectrum, and one of them is in the middle. That person that's in the middle, which most of us do lie somewhere in the middle on most spectrums, we're not usually on either extreme. If we're around that extraordinarily charismatic person, might consider ourselves not very charismatic. But when we're around the person that is not very engaging, we might think, wow, I have some magnetism, huh? Again, it's all relative, which is why it is not very stable to get your sense of self based on comparison. And not only comparing yourself to other people, but comparing yourself to how you are in different situations. Because like we talked about, you are different in different settings and around different people. Like you literally behave different in those different settings. That's why personality tests are often not accurate. You take a personality test in a certain phase of life. Let's say that you're working in a research lab. Because that really requires working with sensory work and here and now and practical things, you might score lower on intuition in Myers-Briggs. But then another time in your life, if you were working in marketing and you had to think more big picture and possibilities and creative, maybe you score higher on intuition. Which one is really you? It all is. This brings up the question, are we now who we were? And my view on this is yes, there's still a core of you that is the same, but you have those new wrinkles or divots or deviations from experiences that have happened between then and now. Imagine a child that is rewarded for their achievements. They bring home good grades, they win competitions, they play sports at a high level, and their parents keep telling them how amazing that is, how amazing they are. And then they develop a sense of self-worth based on their achievement. That might lead them to be an Enneagram 3. I don't know if you've heard of the Enneagram, but it is a personality test that measures based on your deepest motivations. What motivates you? Is it knowledge? Is it freedom? Is it security? It's a really neat test because it does measure these deeper motivations. However, I believe, as I'm talking about in this video, that there are limits to all personality assessments for these reasons that we're talking about in this video. Was that person naturally an Enneagram 3, or did they become that way through life experiences? So an Enneagram 3 feels that they get their self-worth through achievement. Now, I believe Enneagram does actually cover the fact that these personalities are essentially like costumes that we put on to get our needs met. And that's something that I really wanted to draw attention to in this video, is that a lot of your personality is a costume that you've put on to get certain needs met, to feel good enough, to receive love, to feel safe in the world. What is something that you've used as a shield? Is it humor instead of vulnerability? Is it being right? And that's how you feel safe because you know that you're valued if you're intelligent. You'll keep your job. You'll be impressive to other people, maybe even attract a mate that way. Mate, making it sound like animals, but we are. But what if you could learn to use other tools more effectively so that you're not stuck in a rut, so that you're not using only one way of being? It's kind of like, the water that keeps flowing in one direction. It forms a canyon, potentially, but what if that water had the ability to move in all sorts of different directions? And I'm not talking about being a chameleon here to get what you want out of different situations. I'm talking about learning to tap into more of your authentic true self, which is such a tricky question. What is you? What was adapted to get by in the world, and what's underneath that? One other aspect of authenticity is this flexibility and dynamic nature of allowing change and allowing yourself to be who you are in this moment. So think of the person that's always perky. They won't allow themselves to admit that they're having a bad day or just low energy. They are probably not perky in every single moment, but it's sort of again, that costume that they've plastered on to not only their face, but their entire way of being. And it's almost rigid. Now, I do understand. I think of someone like Ted Lasso, who uses his positive energy as a way to buoy both himself and others up. But even him, there's some dynamic nature over time. He's not one way in every situation. Or think of the person that's always a bit sarcastic and biting with their one-liners. They won't even allow themselves to be upbeat or positive. It's this lack of fluidity that I would like to limit. I want us to feel, in my notes here, I wrote, authenticity is flexible. It's showing up who you are in that moment versus a pattern or a story of who you are and who you have to be. I think that though, when you are being your authentic self, there's a lightness that comes with it. There's a sense of freedom. We can't do it around every person. We're not safe to do it around every person and in every situation. You can't just blurt out whatever you feel like in a professional setting and expect to keep your job, at least not in most jobs. Your true self has certain things maybe they want to try, maybe has something that you've put away and stuffed down. And just little bits of letting that part out can really provide huge amounts of benefit in your life. And this frees us up from the limiting beliefs we have. Well, I don't try new things. I really like to just be in my routine. I don't really like to do stuff that I'm not comfortable doing. Well, really? What if you just did a little bit? What if you just did one tiny thing that was a little bit different that day? What if you just cooked something new? Are you then someone that tries some new things? Feels comfortable at that? Who's to say? You just did. We have to prove it to ourselves through action. So creating a new identity or a new personality, which by the way, can be extremely freeing in terms of self-development or habits you want to build. So many people in the field have written about this. I believe it was in Atomic Habits, James Clear, but other people have written and researched this, is that instead of saying, I don't smoke or I'm not smoking right now, I am not a smoker. As you say that, part of you might not believe it, but as you don't smoke cigarettes, the more days that go by, you start to actually believe that and you're adopting a new identity. I am someone that works out. I am an exerciser. I go to the gym 3 times a week. Granted, one of that was a verb and 2 of those were nouns, but it's adding the verb and the noun. Do the thing and then saying that you're the person. Be the person. As you're adopting new personality traits that you want to adopt. But I think that even then, be careful. Be careful with what you're building as the foundation of your self-esteem. Who are you, I think, is so much more profound than what you do or some positive or negative attributes that you might have, what you like, where you live. I think who you are, the reason why I started this video out with a nod to spirituality and the soul is I do think that there's something underneath that. So I'd be careful with building up your identity in this like self-development way of just like trying to adopt all of these great habits. If you are trying to be more social, saying like, oh, I'm the kind of person that loves going out and meeting new people. And then you do that, you might convince yourself that you're that kind of person, but that's not really who you are. That's one of thousands of things that make you who you are, and who you are will change and evolve over time. And that's okay. I also think that we need to question like, what is good? Why do we think that being gregarious in certain ways is a positive thing? I mean, there's a lot of pushback, I think, from the introverted community, which is great because even something, a personality trait as negatively viewed as neuroticism has some positive traits. There's a lot of evolutionary reasons for a lot of traits that maybe don't seem the most positive. It helps to have some people that get worried about stuff because guess what? They're the alarm bells when other people are asleep. So if you're neurotic, it's okay. I'm a little neurotic. I'm trying to tell myself that it's okay. I realize that I'm speaking very abstractly, and that can sometimes be frustrating for people that like to have things be a bit more specific. So I will always in these videos try to give some tangible advice when possible. And one way to start to understand some of your uniqueness and gifts and who you are at that core, kind of underneath some of these more superficial measures that we might compare based off of, I would recommend you go to character strengths. I will link that down below. And I guess one could call them skill sets, but I find them deeper than that. I really do find them a bit of who you are as a person. And I will share with you what my number one strength is so that you can kind of get an idea of what these are. So mine is zest. And zest is defined as, zest means approaching a situation or life in general with excitement and energy, not approaching the tasks or activities halfway or half-heartedly. People who are high in zest are excited to get up in the morning and they live their life like an adventure. It really does feel like it taps into who I am. Part of the reason I have this channel and podcast is because I'm just so excited about so many topics and I want to dive into them and explore them and talk about them. It is an excitement and an energy and an adventure. And I think that that is an example of something that's more than just like, oh, this person is smart or not smart, or different things that I think are a bit more objective and almost objectify us. This almost taps into that essence that I'm getting at. A lot of these strengths It's hard to explain. It feels less quantifiable on the outside and more just an authentic way of being. And so anyway, I don't know if you'll feel the same way, but I think you should take the test if you want to, and then see if this helps kind of get at that authentic core that is underneath a lot of the things that you present out to the world. Like, yes, it is a personality assessment, but it's one that I find uplifting and positive. I also think it's important to define illusion, also from Oxford. A thing that is or is likely to be wrongly perceived or interpreted by the senses. Another definition is a false idea or belief. I think the last definition is probably more what we're talking about here, a false idea of who we are, which this is just trying to ask, yes, you've been that person, but can you be someone else? Can you change? And of course you can. You've changed before. Think of some area that you've changed in. Think of some way that you used to be that you're not now. I was listening to a podcast on time lately this week, and it was amazing. And one way they defined time, which the researcher actually did not want to have to define time because it's so complicated, but she said time is change. That's how we perceive time. If there was no change, it would be really hard to perceive that there's been a passage of time. You will change as time goes on. They also say that people think the version of themselves they are now is who they're going to be for the rest of their life. Like, oh yeah, I was really different in the past, but this is the true me. This is who I'm going to be. But then people actually change far more than they ever anticipate or realize. And with that knowledge, what's the direction that you want to set for that trajectory of change? What direction do you want to go in? What is one area of your life that you want to change to be a different kind of person? And if in a lot of ways we get to choose who we are, who do you want to be? Here are some common questions that come up on this topic. I disagree with what you're saying. People have a somewhat fixed and stable personality. Is this research backed? Well, glad you asked. Culture and research has gone back and forth as to what is in fashion to argue. And I'm going to actually cite a podcast I was listening to by a researcher who specifically studied personality change over time. That's like her main focus of research. And she was discussing that at one point, a certain book came out and it became thought that personality just can't be studied because it's so variable. And then she was saying in this podcast that personality researchers kind of pushed back and said, no, personality is stable. They kind of pushed so far in that direction that then people thought, oh, you can't change your personality. It's fixed. It's stable. And then this pendulum was kind of swinging back and forth through these pushes because they pushed so far in that direction. Personality is stable. Then it started to come out all this stuff about neuroplasticity and how we're making new connections and our brain does evolve over time. Then there was a period of time, some of you might remember this, where it's like, well, yeah, up until 30, you can change. But then after 30, your personality is set and locked in. Then research came out that yes, neuroplasticity applies throughout our lifetime. It is not like, oh, you're 30 years old, now you're just who you are. Where they've landed on now is that personality can change, but it is slow to change. And I do see that to a large extent. Also, research is always going to be a little bit more conservative in what they say. They want to make sure that things are proven. So the self-help industry is really like, you can be whoever you want to be at any moment. And I don't want to come across too far in that direction in this video. And part of what research is studying is how can we maybe shape policy, knowing that personalities are relatively stable, but that certain personality traits are more desirable for a society. For those of us that want to take things into our own hands, I think a few things can be helpful. Remembering times that we have changed or people that we have seen change, to remember that change is possible. I'm going to read a wonderful quote from the show Billions by Wendy Rhodes, who is a psychiatrist and performance coach. And this was when Wags felt like he wasn't the same person that he used to be and was feeling kind of bad about himself. And she said back, "You're still the same person. It's the circumstances around you that have changed. Those moves, that's in your bones. You just need to find an opportunity that will activate the muscle memory." So knowing that our environment affects our personality, I think an interesting question you can ask yourself is how can you put yourself in the environments or do certain things to activate those parts of yourself that you want to be activated. Going off of the idea that change in one's personality is hard and that we are relatively stable when left to our own devices, I have a few more thoughts to still further create change. One, it will feel funny at first. I have heard a therapist talk about this, that when you change, like for instance, doing something like set a boundary, it feels like brushing your teeth with your left hand. You are doing a new behavior. It will feel funny at first, and that's okay. Just know it. Knowing it helps. Another thing is that one area at a time. If we know that change is difficult, I would not try to change too much at once. One facet of your personality at once. And again, it's not even necessarily personality. I think right now I'm getting a little bit broad. If we're thinking though in terms of identity or behavior, the things you do, etc., as part of who you are, I would say one at a time is helpful, knowing that it's hard. Another point is that often it is small, like they said. Personality is relatively stable, but can change. So I do like to remind people that it starts small, but it does compound over time. A friend of mine did not get the best grades in high school. They got okay grades. They were in relatively hard classes, but they're just kind of middle of the pack in those classes. However, I've known them as they've become an adult and they have taken continuing education classes. They prioritized learning about their finances. They've kept up with current events. They've read business books. They've learned from mentors, and they have over the years really grown in their career just by these small changes over time that over a decade really compound. While who they are in some ways in their core is a similar person, who they are in a lot of ways, their behaviors or how the outside world might perceive them has really shifted. So I think what we're really getting at here is not, is personality an illusion, but rather, is personality fixed or is it fluid? Coming at it from the idea of as bold of a claim as is personality an illusion made me question how fluid personality can be. Another question, is what you're talking about here just nature versus nurture? No. Nature versus nurture is a bit of a misnomer. In my opinion, it is more nature and nurture. Even something as seemingly comprehensively genetic as height is actually only 80% genetics. Still 20% of, proper nutrition or what happened while the baby was in the womb. So many other factors can actually determine what height that person will actually end up being. So instead of thinking of it as nature versus nurture, thinking of it as nature and nurture and how those two things interact and combine. That's not really new. I remember doing a paper on nature versus nurture in 8th grade, and which is quite a bit of time ago at this point, and that was already kind of the prevailing theory there. So I don't think that's controversial to say. What about personality tests like Myers-Briggs or the Big Five? This also brings up the question of a type versus a trait. I have noticed that a lot of researchers, professors, or people in the field that are a bit more academically minded prefer examining traits, not types. A personality trait could be examined through looking at the Big Five, which is agreeableness, open-mindedness, extroversion, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. Part of the reason why researchers find this more accurate as a way to evaluate people is because those traits are on a continuum. Most people are not 100% of a certain trait. They lie somewhere on that continuum. This is partially why it really irks me when people, no offense to anyone that does this, I'm probably going to offend people here, but when people are like, I'm not an extrovert or an introvert, I'm an ambivert. It's like, yeah, of course. You mean you like some time with people and you like some time alone? You mean like you're a human? I'm being a little bit harsh there because I do understand that some people are squarely in the middle. And in that case, sure, you can call yourself an ambivert. You've earned it. But most people do lie somewhere on a continuum between these. And so with something that is a type test like Myers-Briggs, they're taking a bunch of these continuums and then they're saying based on which way you land on a bunch of them, you fit into this bucket or type. But it doesn't acknowledge where on those continuums you are. So for instance, if you're kind of in the middle on a bunch of the different continuums, you might feel like your Myers-Briggs type doesn't really fit you. Are you arguing that when we change based on environment, it's not really us? Like the dog bite example, the person then being afraid of dogs, or the child being rewarded based on achievement, then defining themselves based on their achievement. Are you saying that because that was based on their environment, that's not really them? I'm arguing It is you still, but it doesn't have to be. If you have changed as the result of your life experiences, then we can cultivate new life experiences that help shape us in new ways. We have some agency in this. An example of agency would be something like CBT's exposure therapy. So if the person that was afraid of dogs didn't want to be anymore, they could work with a CBT professional and slowly expose themselves to that fear gradually and systematically over time. What a lot of researchers are studying that I am really grateful for is a lot of this that I'm talking about here is somewhat research and somewhat speculative. And where the researchers are coming from is like, no, how do we systematically change personality? So I do think that that is worth reading about and diving into over time, especially as the field progresses. I realize that some of this might not even really be personality, like someone being afraid of dogs or not being afraid of dogs. Like if one were looking at this psychologically, like that might not necessarily be like a feature of their personality as most people define personality. However, I'm sort of looking at it, I'm defining personality features as like kind of just like the thousands and thousands of features that just make up you, whether they're quirks or beliefs or attitudes, common behaviors you take, not just like, oh, the big five. So that's why a lot of these examples have been pretty wide ranging. What about personality disorders is another question. So 2 things. One, that is outside of the scope of this video. I am not a licensed professional because part of what defines a personality disorder is that their personality is inflexible. It is persistent across many situations. It is persistent across a long time. Someone might ask then, can someone with a personality disorder change? That's really out of my scope to say definitively, but my belief is that it really depends. They would need proper treatment. They would need to want to be helped. That's part of the reason why narcissism is very difficult, is because the person doesn't perceive there to be any problem. So the person has to want to be helped and work with a professional. And it may depend on how far on the spectrum they are, because many of these personality disorders are on a spectrum, and it may depend to what extent it's biological versus trauma response. My personal belief, though, is that with a desire to change and proper care, we can all end up in a better place than we were. Might some aspects of life be harder and an ongoing journey? Yes, we're all on these ongoing journeys, and that is potentially one aspect of their journey. Acknowledgement of this fact that their personality is harder to shift, and working with a professional and a big dose of self-love and compassion, I believe, can all help. Another question that might come up. Different personalities are a fun aspect of life. Can't we just enjoy this and not overcomplicate it? Yes, I do see that. I want to acknowledge that certain personality differences are part of what make life fun and exciting. Just take 2 different dogs. I'm using dogs in a lot of examples, but I was thinking about this when I was around a dog the other day, how they have their own idiosyncrasies, like curling up in a really, really tight ball when they jump up on the couch, or singing a song when they're happy to see you, a little howl. That stuff is adorable, and I think that people have those attributes too. You know, part of what makes watching a show really fun is how unique the different characters are. A lot of times what TV writers are doing are taking these different archetypes and making them more exaggerated. Like someone such as Jess on New Girl is, you know, this very, speaking of quirks, very quirky, hardworking, caring, silly person, good friend, but it's like they amplify her to the point that she's a little bit past a person that you would probably meet in real life, but not totally implausible to the point where it feels like, okay, that's not really a real person anymore. You could meet her in real life. And then they just have these different types of personalities interacting on the show. It's like, okay, you have somebody as different as her and Nick. How are they going to get along? What is the kind of humor that will result from those 2 very different types of people interacting? And if you think of any sitcom that you've liked, really that's what's happening, is it is an exploration of personality. Now, I think part of why I'm doing this video is not to take the fun out of personality typing or seeing the interplay between different types of people. It's just to remember that we are not TV characters. They do grow and evolve through the show, but they often will keep them pretty pigeonholed into a certain way of being. Otherwise, it ruins the comedy, and it also makes it a little bit hard to understand for the viewer. So they do allow them to be dynamic, especially over many seasons. You'll notice that characters when they're given more than 3 seasons, they do have a little bit more room to evolve and change. It's jarring, though, when it happens too quickly. A last example here, and then we'll bid adieu, is I've been watching Office superfans. I bring up The Office a decent amount on this show. You can probably tell that I'm a superfan. So what the superfans episodes are is where they show all the stuff that was cut that was also filmed. So like the deleted scenes, but not just deleted scenes like at the end, like, oh, this is a bunch of stuff that was cut. They're showing it where it was intended to be. So it's like instead of the episode being 22 minutes, it's like 35 minutes. And you see all of this amazing juicy stuff that was left out. But I've noticed a lot of stuff that was cut is not just funny improv stuff that I actually still think is mostly good, but maybe didn't land as much as other scenes, so then they cut those, sure. A lot of what they cut is things like Angela, who's usually the uptight one, not as warm. Maybe there's a scene where her and Andy are actually having a scene where they really connect and are laughing and giggling, and it's sweet, and she just seems extremely warm. I've noticed they'll cut that. I think they get concerned that it would almost be hard for the viewer to wrap their head around her as this type of a character if they show too many contrasting things. Or like, we're supposed to be rooting for Pam and Jim, even though I think if you read on Reddit, a lot of people have issues with them, but whatever. We're supposed to be rooting for Pam and Jim. I noticed there was a prank that Pam played on Jim that was actually kind of mean, or like it just crossed the line. It wasn't good. It didn't make them look like a very good couple. And I noticed they cut that because they're trying to create a clear narrative. But life is not a clear narrative. It's complicated. And so the point of this video is to just let yourself open up, loosen up a little bit in terms of who you think you are, and just open your mind a little bit up in terms of who you can be. Now, is the self being a separate identity the real illusion? Now that's the question indeed.